Hello, everyone. My name is Mathias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And I am delighted to have you back at our ongoing series towards Life 3.0, which investigates ongoing ethics and human rights related challenges to technological innovation. As you know, we have been doing this series for a number of years now here at the Carr Center. And the name we actually, towards Life 3.0, we are taking from a fascinating book by Max Tegmark about a form of life in which many of the entities that populate it can choose both their mode of behavior and their mode of learning and the physical shapes that they inhabit. So the kind of life form that might is something like an intelligence explosion. But obviously, we're not only going to have ethics and human rights related challenges around technological innovation, around artificial intelligence in particular, if there is such an explosion at some point, but we have plenty of those already at this stage in our technological innovation. So that's the subject matter of this series. I'm delighted to be co-moderating this again today with Albert Fox-Kahn, who is currently a fellow in the Human Rights and Technology program here at the Carr Center. In real life, so to speak, is the executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project in New York City. And our distinguished guest for today is Dr. Sarita Amrute. Will be talking about, the topic is, does cybersecurity make us safe? Let me just say a few things about Sarita and also about the topic. So Sarita just moved to the New School in New York as an associate professor of strategic design at Parsons. She is also a principal researcher at the Data and Society Research Institute, and she continues to be affiliated as an associate professor also on the other side of the country as an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Washington at Seattle. And she is an anthropologist who explores in her work themes around data, race, caste, and capitalism, specifically in global South Asia, but also in Europe and the United States. And German, I find it quite intriguing that one of her books is called Encoding Race, Indian IT Workers in Berlin, which is about taking a closer look, as anthropologists do, of the lives of highly skilled Indian IT coders in Berlin, who reveal the often obscured reality, whose existence there reveals the obscured realities of the embodied race and class nature of cognitive labor. So on the one hand, these are workers who are highly racialized in Germany as temporary workers, yet at the same time, their middle class aspirations also reflect their efforts to build a new global and economically dominant India. So there's some really intriguing transnational phenomena that Sarita is tracing in her work. And she's now working on a new book called Staying Safer, Activism and Cryptography in the Indian Diaspora. So that is also connecting to the topic of cybersecurity. So again, topic today is, does cybersecurity make us safe? And I will anticipate already that this talk will be a combination of giving us a negative answer to that. Cybersecurity, as we normally understand it, does not make us safe. It makes, at least it doesn't make all of us safe. It makes some of us safe while spreading risk and even violence to others. But there's some hope coming, I think, namely that in response to this situation, we should draw on alternative modes rooted in communities who have actually historically been placed beyond state-based security models. So we have to rethink the security approach here in order to come to a better place in this domain. As always, the way we'll proceed, I will now turn over to Dr. Amrute. And once she is done, Albert and I will pop up. We're going to have a bit of a conversation. And as always, I encourage you in the audience to put your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and integrating that into our conversation. But now, without further ado, over to you, Sarita.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for that very generous introduction. You hit on all the points that I'm going to talk about today. And I should also mention that this is very much a work in progress. So there are things that I'm testing out, and I'm happy to get feedback on all of it. I am going to share a few slides. Can I share slides? It says host disabled participant screen sharing. If I can't, that's okay, but I have some images.
No, we'll give you access. So it's just a matter of this.
Okay.
Emily writes, let's try again.
Okay. Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, that's me. I've already been introduced, so I can skip that slide. We don't have that much time, so I'll see how much of this I can get to. I will definitely get to the last bit about community cybersecurity and the need for a broader shift in perspective, and I may move through the first part a little bit more quickly, but in general, the talk is divided into a few different sections, 4 sections. I'll start with talking about the strange, frankly, anachronistic fact that our cybersecurity discourse, as it's coming to be developed, feels very old. It feels as if we were revisiting a 19th century discourse in the 21st century. And then I'll go over some of the reasons that Mathias already indicated as to why we need a different kind of cybersecurity, what some precedents are there, and why I think we even need to go a little bit more broad. So one of the main pieces that I will be using to make my case is something that was just released by the Biden administration in 2023 called the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And maybe I'll read a little bit from the paper and then also go through the slides. So security, including cybersecurity, seems to require a bad actor. The recent National Cybersecurity Strategy published by the Biden administration, for instance, named China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as dangerous states with threatening cyber attack programs. In discussions around cybersecurity, these actors join references to hackers and cyber criminals to round out a rogues gallery of cybersecurity threat actors. Of course, some hackers and some programs promoted by state governments may indeed represent criminal activities. But when bad actors are named to make arguments for online protections, these gestures provide cover for other actors, like democratic state governments and corporations, to be exempted from similar scrutiny. Is it possible to articulate a different way of doing cybersecurity, one that centers the needs of vulnerable people? To do so, it might be necessary to start with a difficult question. Can we have security without othering? So reading through this national cybersecurity strategy, it occurred to me that the discourse is really one in which people's security is nested within the nation states on the one hand, and then corporations on the other. And here's a quote from that document that really puts this very clear stamp on who the good guys are and who the bad guys are within this model of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity orients toward the future and detours through the past. The President's Office National Cybersecurity Strategy provides a useful case for understanding nation-based cybersecurity strategy and the most current thinking on how powerful nations like the United States are approaching this topic. Other nations like India, for instance, which is the other nation that I think about quite a bit, have also recently published guidelines on cybersecurity. And although a thoughtful comparison between these and similar documents lies outside the scope of this talk, it is important to surface one similarity. Both documents accrue to the state trust and power, albeit by different methods. In the Indian cybersecurity directions, for instance, the very real problem of corporations that handle data failing to log and report data breaches is patched through a broad mandate to log activity for 180 days, keep a record of breaches of users for 5 years, and perhaps most controversially, to retain information in services such as VPNs, virtual networks that are actually meant to protect identity, that operate through no-log protocols. In both this set of regulations and the US strategy, a presumption of state authority and state benevolence blurs the actual threat that states themselves can pose to populations. In the American case, predictably, state agency is augmented directly by corporate agency. Reading through the strategy document, it occurs to me that there is one crucial figure that is not being named: the people. Even if we admit that the idea of the people is a political fiction and that there is not one people, and that many things are done in the name of the people that they themselves would not sanction or condone, it is a glaring admission for a program with comprehensive aspirations. If a national cybersecurity initiative's aim is to keep people safe, what role should they play in creating a safer internet? The people's admission in such documents can at least partially be accounted for by the way that cybersecurity strategies nest people within nation states and to a secondary degree within corporations. Such rhetorical moves, however, must be contradicted with the reality of a world crisscrossed by transnational communications networks. The effect of the logic of this way of laying out people within nation states and corporations is suited imperfectly to fit the realities of the present. But given the large efforts to mobilize such policies into practice, understanding this logic, which largely corresponds to the great age of nation states of the 19th century, can help expose how we have developed a cybersecurity policy that so inadequately addresses the security needs of people and communities. The great age of nation states reappears in documents like the National Cybersecurity Strategy, like the raiment from another era. Such vestments are donned to capture the spirit of an age in which nation states' power was waxing. The strategy proceeds as if forms of communication and commerce remain largely within the domain of national governance. In such a national understanding of the internet, fiber optic cables connect us. We pick up our phones to connect with our loved ones and trade, and national policy can make such a world of communication among citizens possible. In a historical echo of the national imagined community instantiated through previous mass communications media, such as the internet and newsprint before it, the potential to create horizontal bonds of national sentiment arises, in a nod to Benedict Anderson. Yet malicious actors threaten this connectivity. To follow the logic of this argument further, it suggests that most malicious actors operate outside the boundaries of the United States. Such actors need to be held in check by the concerted efforts of other nation states working in concert to uphold the rule of law. Many find much value in the principles of nation states, including recourse to human rights and to the protection of basic rights to meet our online needs. Yet these pole stars of protecting liberty nest within a larger framework that valorizes nation states as entities that will keep persons safe. It does so even though we live in a world in which the meaning of state borders are contested, the flow of money, especially digital money, goods, and ideas across the borders is largely promoted. To aid nation states in producing safety online, the National Cybersecurity Strategy calls on corporations. As a document, the National Security Strategy is designed to establish guidelines for how nations and businesses can work together to produce safe infrastructures and systems for users. In its pages, the strategy makes clear that large corporations and national governments shoulder much of this responsibility. According to an explanation of these pillars provided at a discussion at the Aspen Institute, corporations, like individuals, are end users of online technologies, but their large size and their use of massive amounts of consumer data make them important players in creating cybersecurity practices for the nation. The role of these pillars is at once to take away unnecessary burdens from corporations and small businesses for maintaining secure systems, and to put the onus on corporations to protect users' data. In this formulation, small businesses and individuals need to be protected. They will best be protected through the joint efforts of national government and large corporations. So in other words, reading through this cybersecurity document, reading through similar ones produced by other states, I get this uncanny feeling that we've in a sense moved backwards in time. The idea is that nation states are the best containers for social life, for human life. The idea is that corporations and states are going to work together to protect all of us. And in the midst of all of this, what gets occluded or erased is what the people's role is in creating a safer internet, and of course, what gets erased, one would expect this, is any ability to question the activities of states and corporations and their record on making us safe. So now I'm going to move a little bit into why having a people's perspective on the question of national security is important. Yes, so to say it quickly, the safety needs of people are not covered by states or corporations. There are three large reasons why the safety needs of people fall outside the domain of states and corporations. First, some persons do not find themselves within the purview of either. Second, neither states nor corporations have historically been good actors when it comes to protecting people. And third, historical cases show that some communities most in need of cyber protections have not been able to rely on states and corporations to help them. So first, I'll talk about those who fall outside either the protection of the state or the corporation. Perhaps the most evident category of persons without state or corporate protection is the migrant. Migrant vulnerability to surveillance, data theft, and abuse of power can be ongoing, or it can be time limited. For all migrants, border crossings, paperwork such as visas and passports, and interactions with state bureaucracies are scenarios that are fraught with danger. In these moments, migrants are subject to multiple kinds of data checks, controls, and investigations. It is not clear that all of these fall within the rule of law, and there is much latitude for abuse by local officials who may demand access to social media feeds, devices, biometrics, and various kinds of digital documents. Adding to these risks, migrants encounter multiple and various vectors for theft and scam around border crossings. Many of these scams may be perpetuated by street-level bureaucrats who make their living in border zones, both real and virtual, and traffic in travel documents and identity cards. For some migrants, all of these risks are heightened. Those who cross borders clandestinely or in war-torn geographies similarly will not be covered by the kinds of cybersecurity practices imagined to reside in nation states or corporations. So migrants are a clear category of person that fall outside the way cybersecurity discourse has been set up to date. Migrants, including refugees, provide an evident example of persons falling outside the protection of states and corporations. Other similarly situated persons would include prisoners, internal minority populations, and stateless populations, or even in some cases, journalists, legal professionals, and everyone living or working in expansively defined border areas. And I'm taking that term from a very good report that I'm showing you the cover of here called the Deadly Digital Border Wall, which really tracks all the various sorts of surveillance technologies that are existing on the US southern border and the way that they create this very expansively defined border zone. So extending way into what is formerly the territory of the United States, and they could sort of capture everybody into this surveillance apparatus. What is more, for many of these populations, corporations provide vendor services to states to surveil rather than protect them. And probably the case that comes most readily to mind here are the Muslim Uyghur population in China or prison populations in the United States. So first, there's a big category of persons who simply do not fall within what's considered the good subjects worthy of protection in national and corporate-backed cybersecurity policy. And this is a case that I think Albert knows very well. There are many clear failures of state and corporate protection when it comes to cybersecurity activities and policies. The second objection to cybersecurity as protecting individuals through state and corporation initiatives arises from the poor historical record of each when it comes to protecting individuals. Arguably, the national strategy and conversations around cybersecurity currently circulating in Washington, D.C. are designed to mitigate these harms. Yet the record suggests that centering people in the various forms of community in which they organize is necessarily part of this corrective, but it's not there yet. To make note of just a few examples of state and corporate harms, we can look at recent privacy and hacking concerns regarding large language sets and a record of internal surveillance on the part of countries like the United States and India. The use of Pegasus, and I don't have a slide on this one, but it's worth looking up. The use of Pegasus spyware and facial recognition to infiltrate internal dissident networks suggests that government agencies protect rights and free expression unequally across their populations. That's probably the most mild way of saying that. To cite one example, a report completed by the US Government Accountability Office found that 6 US federal agencies use facial recognition technologies to monitor Black Lives Matter protesters, including peaceful protesters, but only half that number did so to monitor participants in the January 6 attacks on the Capitol building, suggesting that federal agencies inequitably apply surveillance technologies in the field. And another really interesting fact in that report is that most of these agencies use non-governmental AI in their practices with very little oversight, which was the report's main finding and what it asked to be corrected. A second good example of deficiencies in corporate and state cybersecurity comes from ChatGPT. And I think we've all heard quite a bit about ChatGPT, but just to surface one very, very important finding here, ChatGPT is vulnerable in at least 2 directions to privacy and security lapses. The first direction comes from the fact that ChatGPT and other forms of AI that depend on large data sets can be simply queried with something as simple as, for instance, where does Mathias Risse live? And it can shoot out an answer. So there's one clear vector for privacy violations there already. And the second one, which is very disturbing as well, is that because they in fact reproduce what's largely available online, ChatGPT image AI systems as well can be vulnerable to coordinated attack. That is, if a group of people want to create a certain narrative about a minority group, for instance, Muslims in a particular country, troll farms and human networks, bot networks can simply flood the internet with information. These AI systems scrape that information and will suddenly start producing a lot of negative content about that group when they're queried. So I think this is another very clear, very serious case of a lack of corporations' interest in protecting our security and our safety online. I'm going to then talk about a fairly ridiculous version of the same problem because I think it really gets at some of the more everyday fine-grained effects of the failure of corporate protection for us online. As I was writing this paper, I am not a huge user of Twitter, but I check it now and again, and I logged in and I got this lovely message that told me because I am not a Twitter Blue subscriber, I can no longer use two-factor authentication on Twitter. Now, two-factor authentication has been supported as an easy way for people to protect themselves online. In fact, the FTC still has an article that tells us to enable two-factor identification rather than simply using a password to protect ourselves. And in this moment, I find it very ironic that these sorts of systems that have been touted as ways for us to take care of our own digital hygiene are now increasingly behind paywalls. So if you can't pay, you can't access it. Now, I should say as a caveat, security professionals will tell you that even two-factor identification is really not good enough, and that, in fact, we need to move towards other ways of verifying. In fact, they'll say that because third parties can access verification codes in transit, two-factor identification is in fact not that safe. On the other hand, once an idea like two-factor identification has been socialized, it takes time, it takes effort to get people to adopt these methods. It seems extremely capricious that corporate CEOs can simply decide that we all have to pay for it now. So clearly, I think this is a good example of corporations not really having our security interests forefront in their plans. So I want to spend some time here in the last 10 minutes talking about what alternatives to either state-backed or corporate-backed cybersecurity. And these alternatives actually themselves have a very long history. In the formal paper, I write about one of the earliest examples of community-based cybersecurity, which was in the anti-apartheid movement of the African National Congress, in which they established a network, a communications network between England, the Netherlands, South Africa, and other places on the African continent where members of the ANC were in exile. This is a really fascinating story to read about. It uses phones and tape recorders, and it's really one of the earliest examples of a cybersecurity network built from the ground up. But I don't really have time to tell that whole story right now. And I will talk a little bit about some more recent developments. So the two biggest trends in developing community cybersecurity have been tech skill shares and strengthening civil society actors. And I think that both of these are extremely important developments, but on their own, they're not enough. And so therefore, I will argue at the end that we need to broaden out our definitions of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is often thought of and practiced by technical experts. Presumptions of technical expertise can be off-putting to those who believe they do not possess them, especially when non-expert users are treated by information security experts as if they were adversaries who will mostly fail to deploy security tools successfully. And this has been an ongoing and long-standing problem in the information security world, that there's always a gap between experts and non-experts, and non-experts are, in a sense, undervalued for what they bring to the table, which is a lot of knowledge about how communities work and what communities need. One decades-old tactic to democratize cybersecurity, to make techniques to enhance online safety available to more people and communities, is to organize cybersecurity training programs and manuals. These trainings can take many forms. Perhaps the most well-known is the crypto party. If we were live, I would probably ask people to raise their hands if they have heard of crypto parties, but that's a little harder to do on Zoom. These trainings can take many forms. Perhaps the most well-known is the crypto party, as I mentioned. A crypto party is a somewhat informal gathering of people and devices where people update their devices with software to protect them from unwanted intrusions. These parties are usually led by someone who shares knowledge during the event. Crypto parties often explicitly cultivate a subversive and informal environment through playing movies or music and making references to popular culture. Such events and guidebooks that accompany them explicitly cut against cybersecurity as a rarefied practice controlled from above. Instead, crypto parties are part of an attempt to socialize the notion of taking care of oneself and one's devices broadly among those who might be vulnerable to online threats. Crypto parties and crypto handbooks for different types of communities have evolved beyond libations, films, and skill shares. Some of these mature efforts include the Disorganization Toolkit, Citizens Lab Security Planner, and Tactical Tech's Holistic Security, a strategy manual for human rights defenders. These guides often include discussions of degrees of risk, as well as explanations of why cybersecurity matters across the world and for whom. The idea of holistic security, for instance, arises from the movement to democratize security practices. It describes security as, and this is a quote, a deeply personal, subjective, and gendered concept that affects in particular those who are trying to bring about positive social change. By defining security as interconnected and comprehensive, the organizers of the Holistic Security Manual explicitly bring physical and psychological threats together to create safety for community organizations. The goal is not to be safe doing nothing, the Holistic Security Manual states, but to consciously face threats and protect ourselves and our communities as much as possible so that we can still be engaged and active. Yet in practice, some of these efforts calcify master-novice relationships between those convening cybersecurity trainings and attendees, so that divide between expert and non-expert actors is not entirely bridged by even the most thoroughgoing of these training efforts. The history of the crypto party itself is instructive here. Asher Wolf, who was one of the founders of it, a woman, eventually left the crypto party movement because citing sexism and belittling of her supposedly non-technical contributions. Another means of protecting the online lives of communities is to increase the capacity of nonprofit groups to act. An example of this direction includes digital forensic arms of major civil society actors, such as Amnesty International, which can track surveillance efforts practiced by states against their own citizens. Such digital forensic programs can be an important tool in proving the veracity of human rights abuse claims. These efforts also strengthen the link between cybersecurity and basic human rights in popular discourse by making it clear that attempts to surveil dissidents or harass minorities online impinge on basic rights and freedoms. Democratizing tools and strengthening civil society actors are important steps in creating a cybersecurity for the people as a counterweight to state and corporate-backed cybersecurity, one that can continue to operate even when state and corporate actors fail to protect communities and even willingly expose them to surveillance and harassment as part of law enforcement policies and capitalist modes of production. Still, a broader shift in cybersecurity practice necessitates an equally broad shift in perspective. Security needs to be defined in the absence of external enemies as a principle that should apply to all, regardless of how individuals might be labeled, situated, or classified. And this is my last little bit here. I know we want to leave time for discussion. To do so, cybersecurity should be attentive to context, value the caring labor of low-tech security work, acknowledge graduated risk profiles within communities, and recognize that cybersecurity is often established imperfectly and temporarily. And this last little bit is based on a set of ethnographic interviews I've conducted with community security professionals and with working with dissident communities in the Indian diaspora. And I'll just say a little bit about each of these categories, and then we can move on to discussion. So on context, all cybersecurity community researchers I spoke with agreed that the most important thing to develop is an understanding of the context of a group or even an individual. While app and social media companies mostly only react when someone has been heard, and news media reports on their story, getting to know communities for whom security is important can lead to producing better thought out tools. Understanding needs can take time. It also requires valuing conversation among community, spending time with community members in a reliable fashion, or more colloquially called showing up for community, and thinking through questions of communications and all style, both visually and in terms of making community members feel valued, seen, and heard. On caring labor. Cybersecurity work can be very low tech, such as explaining the dangers involved in sharing bank account numbers. It can be helpful for many people to have someone to go to routinely to update their devices or explain what others think of as so basic as if to be self-understood. Yet this low-tech work is rarely valued in information security. This approach comes with a recognition about the work that people are doing and of their backgrounds, which can vary by languages spoken and degrees of literacy within a community. Although cybersecurity discourses stray far from discourses of labor and barely touch on those of care, One radical move to make a cybersecurity that is for and of the people might be to recognize that doing cybersecurity work is an act of caring labor. The labor of care has traditionally been undervalued as women's unseen and unpaid work. More recently, self-care is lauded as a means to be resilient in the face of precarious economies and global pandemics. Yet a more radical kind of care would refuse both these designations in favor of valorizing repetitive and material practices that lack the glamour implied in the very term cyber. Moving in this direction will value what is often considered corrosive and perfunctory, updating passwords, using old devices, sharing passwords with community members. It will acknowledge these more material practices of doing caring labor, and it will also help move discourses on security from achieving mastery to an ongoing form of service. On risk profiles. Establishing risk profiles has grown in importance across community-based security efforts. These profiles begin with the premise that each person faces different levels of exposure to harassment and attack, and that they also have different tolerances for facing those risks. Risk profiles necessarily understand a community is made up of different kinds of subjects, even if they all come together for a particular purpose or around one of many possible identities. Security as impermanent and temporary. Community cybersecurity's reality is putting together out of what is available and solving security challenges by trial and error. Yet these realities rarely make it into collective understandings of what cybersecurity is or should be. Security professionals often erase or feel the need to correct these everyday approximations. The tendency toward correction is unhelpful. It perpetuates the idea that there are a set of proper tools and practices. Such a mindset ignores the actual conditions under which people enact cybersecurity protocols and reinforce a false belief in complete, perfect security achieved through the correct deployment of the right tools, and perhaps even by the right, in quotes, actors, state and corporate actors. In contrast to these notions of perfectibility and permanence, most community members imagine security to be a temporary achievement. Instead of aiming for perfect security, it makes sense to value impermanent solutions. This approach's greatest advantage is that it replaces an ambition to create absolute safety with one that is tuned to the actual practices of those who need to be kept safe. Cyber, derived from the Greek cognates for steersman, connotes not only control and governance, but also steering by technical mechanistic means. When states and corporations steer our safety, they imagine threats as existing on the outside and elevate some among us as worthy of protection. Instead, we should steer our life online from the principles of graduated risk, context, caring labor, and imperfection. Thank you. Let's see. Need to stop share. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such an amazing and thought-provoking presentation. I think there, especially with the way my work overlaps with so much of what you're presenting on, there's so many things I want to ask you about. But the thing that I think is most topical, I'd love your take on, is how you view a lot of the cybersecurity and national security discourse around TikTok through the lens of this community-driven work. And because there both appears to be this sort of nationalistic double standard on TikTok's privacy practices that, is quite analogous to what you pointed out in the White House priorities. But there also seems to be real harm being done through TikTok's data collection practices. And so I just wanted to hear what you have thought about that discourse in Congress in recent weeks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I try to think about the anti-China discourse together with the pro-Ukraine discourse. I think they're actually part of the same discursive space. And what's happening in both directions is this kind of elevation of the US as the good actor in the room. It supports the Ukrainian movements on the ground, and it protects us from Chinese incursion. And so, of course, there are real harms being done by TikTok, but TikTok is not the only company engaging in these harms. So what I think is so corrosive here is the ability of a nationalistic discourse to actually provide cover for or erase the actions of putative democratic countries and nation states and corporations that seem American. Of course, they're all transnational, right? And there's a whole another thing we could say about TikTok and Singapore, which I think is interesting as well, because the CEO of TikTok, if you look at those congressional hearings, I mean, they were quite xenophobic, and his relationship to China as a place is actually very complicated. So things get telescoped down and collapsed into these very simple terms.
Thank you for that. By the way, to the audience, do put your questions in the, in fact, there's a question coming in right now, so I'm just going to pass this right on. So the question from the audience coming in, how would the effectiveness of cybersecurity methods be impacted by a shift from centralized services such as Twitter to distributed or federated services such as Mastodon or ActivityPub?
That's interesting. So I can speak more to Mastodon, and let me just say I'm not actually seeing the Q&A, so I can't read them at the same time. I don't know if that's a glitch on Zoom, but on Mastodon, I think what's interesting about Mastodon is it acts a little bit more like Reddit, in which the Mastodon groups make their own rules and they enforce their own rules. So it's very much decentralized. I can't really speak to the other part of the question. And I think, you know, taking the case of some of these decentralized spaces, studies have shown, for instance, that on Reddit, the work of the moderators is actually extremely effective in creating safer spaces because they are community moderated by humans. So, I mean, I think in general, my answer is not, there isn't a perfect technological solution. The solutions as an anthropologist that I always surface or highlight or elevate are ones in which community practices and technologies work in concert or work in synthesis. And you know, to put another spin on it, going back to the very word cyber, right? It was coined by really Norbert Wiener. It's possible that Claude Shannon suggested it to Norbert Wiener, but to describe the field of cybernetics. And of course, Gregory Bateson was an anthropologist and also a great practitioner of cybernetics. And the whole point of his thinking was to ask us to consider biomechanical feedback loops. So to think about human and technological systems as wholes. And what always tends to happen in our discourses around technologies is that we cut those arcs, as he would call them, in particular ways that can help us illuminate parts of the problem, but of course, prevent us from developing solutions that are in consonant with those larger systems and how they operate.
So one thing that really stood out to me was the discussion of how breach notification laws in India could make logless systems, which can be more secure, impossible to operate. I was wondering what other examples you see of where security mandates, safety mandates from nation states potentially put users at greater risk. I don't know if you would consider this too much of a stretch, but do you think there's an analogy here to some of the unintended consequences of laws like Sesta Fosta or the expanded CSAM surveillance efforts by a lot of large messaging platforms, which are oftentimes launched with rhetoric around user safety, but can create huge security risks?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think that, in the case of India, the big difference between the US and India is that Indian cybersecurity directives are very much about centralization. So another thing that they want is that they want all a synchronization among the clocks of these companies to all line up together. And that the unintended consequence here is a little bit like, what is the analogy? Taking a hammer to pound in a needle or something. It's all about creating as much information in the hands of government as possible. And I think the main point that I'm getting at is that there can be unintended consequences in the cases that you mentioned, but it's also true that even a government that calls itself democratic will use this information to police and surveil what it considers unworthy actors. I'm really taking this back to Foucauldian or maybe Mahmoud Mamdani's distinction between the citizen and the subject, that's the kind of disciplinary world that we're in.
Talk about more about corporations. You're taking on both states and corporations, and you're identifying, people who are unprotected in a world designed by states and corporations. Would one important thing that we need to do in that domain just to make, to spread safety more evenly, to break down large companies? Are tech companies too large? There's this phrase, too large to fail, but too large to make us safe. Is there something in the humongous dynamics of these corporate entities that by itself is a problem that could be improved on by cutting them apart?
Yes, I think the main problem, the way I always answer that question, is that self-regulation absolutely doesn't work. And so if cutting them apart means they would be better regulated, that's fine. I don't know if that's a necessary consequence of cutting them apart. So even going back to Albert's question of other examples, the example of where both state and corporate protections fail, a very clear example of this in the Indian case was during the farmers' protests, in which a group of people got together online to create a social media toolkit. They used a Google document to do it. The Google document, by default, its default feature is to have it open, unprotected. The police in India were able to trace everyone's IP addresses who were working on that document, and then activists in India were arrested. Okay. So I think that is a clear moment in which corporate oversight is not working, self-regulation is not working, and that is also a design question. It's a question of how these systems are designed. And it's also a clear moment of the unintended consequences of those design features and how they play out in a context that, to be quite honest, is always neglected, right? The global south is always a context in which the unintended consequences of technologies are thought about way too late. That also applies to ChatGPT and large language models. I mean, I'm almost afraid to do the experiment of querying them on topics that relate to minorities in the global south, because there's very sparse information and there's a great opportunity for manipulation.
Yeah, as someone who's spent way too much time exploring GPT-4 responses lately, I can assure you it's scary out there. I think that's such a crucial point about a lot of the information that's collected by companies being dual use. Information that can be helpful or convenient to a customer can be, turned into a vulnerability by, someone hacking in violation of the law. It can also be a powerful tool for stifling dissent when harnessed by, agents who are able to access that by force of law. And I think one of the trickiest areas I've seen in this space, I would love to hear if you've seen examples of this or thought about it specifically, is ID verification. Because we increasingly are told that there's need for more secure, more robust proof of identification online. We've seen biometric verification rolled out in the US by the IRS, by public benefit groups. Of course, Aadhaar was used in India to collect massive amounts of biometric data. And I'm wondering if you've seen best practices around creating proof identity verification systems that are both robust against attack and robust in preventing government co-option. Sorry, that was a very long-winded question, but basically, how do we prove who we are online without turning that into a tracking device?
Yeah. I cannot provide any best practices. And I think the reason I can't is because one, I don't know if there are that many, but two, the practices of ID verification that I'm looking at are really internal to communities. And so they're about small groups and their need to know who's in the group if they are, for instance, a community of dissenters. So that's a different modality than what you're talking about. I think one place to look, though, is in Sani Kamara's lab at Brown. They're trying to develop ways of verifying ID without necessarily capturing information. And the other thing that they've been working on is ways to share information without necessarily capturing ID. So one of their projects is to allow people to share information about their salaries without revealing whose information it is, but the information would still be verified. So I think you kind of need to be able to do both. Yeah.
Another question from the audience. The question is there a trade-off between cyber or right to be free of censorship?
I couldn't hear that. Trade-off between something and censorship.
Sorry, I'll say it again. Is there a trade-off between cybersecurity and our right to be free of censorship? So I guess to illuminate that a bit, so we talk about cybersecurity, certain things that we need to do in order to implement cybersecurity are imposing constraints on what people can do and say online, which at some point might have to be interpreted as censorship. Is there a trade-off between, therefore, these two concerns, to have cybersecurity in place and we really have it broadly spread, and this desire, namely to be free from censorship?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it gets at something that I didn't illuminate fully in the paper. There's a little bit of a blur in the paper between cybersecurity and online safety. So cybersecurity, as I understand it, is actually, it should be freedom enhancing. So the point of it is to keep us from, for instance, feeling as if we can't say what we mean because we believe either a government or a corporation has all the data it needs about us and can share it, the dual use problem. So I don't think there's any contradiction. And in fact, I think good, robust cybersecurity that's built by and for community helps communities to exercise speech. On the other hand, we also want to have a world in which it can be safer for members of minority communities, let's say women, for instance, is not a minority, but it's a big category that faces huge amounts of harassment online. This is also an intersectional phenomenon. So women from African-American women in India, Muslim women, Dalit women face tremendous amounts of harassment online. And so there, the way the debate has been framed is that there's a clear contradiction between our right to exercise speech and the idea that the internet should be a safe place. But of course, that's only one way of framing the question of free speech. I think we have to ask whose speech is protected. Again, that's the same question. And what's happening in the current moment is that when a Dalit woman, a Muslim woman, African-American woman speaks out, she's much more likely to face a huge amount of hate, threats, and harassment. And that in itself is a kind of censorship. It's a way to stifle her speech.
I'm wondering if you think there's an analogy there to the new parental rights bills governing the access of minors to social media platforms. There's one that was recently enacted, I believe, in Utah. There's several others that are pending, which either give parents a veto on what sites their children can access, access to the content of communications on those platforms. And these are often framed as a protection from external threats to a minor user, but it seems that in many cases they could actually create or augment a threat from within the home. For example, for LGBTQ users whose parents are homophobic or transphobic.
Yeah, Yeah, I think this is a huge, tricky area, and I do think there's an analogy. I mean, it's again about creating subjects worth protecting and subjects not worth protecting in a way. So children is one of the few areas in contemporary American politics that everyone would say is worth protecting. So things are done in the name of children that actually might hurt certain kinds of children, as you say. I'm not an expert in this field, so I don't have an answer to how to get that right, but I do recognize that there is an analogy in the way in which certain kinds of subjects get held up as paragons of whatever it is we think we should be, and then a lot of things are done in their name that produce all these unintended consequences because we haven't thought from the perspective of minorities, right? That's kind of the general shift that I'm trying to enact or make clear, articulate.
Yeah, and this may be a bit hyperbolic, but it seems that just as we assume that the US is always the good guy, just as we assume the large corporations based in the US are always on the right side in things like the White House policy directives, it seems like there's always an assumption that the parents are making the best choices for children when that sadly it often is not the case.
Yeah, and what's quite amazing is once again these are very hoary ideas of personhood. That the person is nested in a household, the household is run by a patriarch. The patriarch is analogous to the head of a state or a corporation. I mean, these are not new ideas, and it's quite amazing to me that in some ways we've returned to those models of society that are centuries old at this point. Maybe we never left them, but they seem to be rising in the ascendant at this moment. And back to your earlier question, some of what I'm hearing when I go to these large DC cybersecurity conferences is this very almost, and this could be hyperbolic, a feeling of relief that we once again know who the good guys and the bad guys are. Right? And it allows for an alignment once again of those figureheads.
Last question, Savita, can you elaborate a little bit on the theme of migrants or refugees, one of those groups? What specifically are the cyber security threats to these groups, and what are in your framework, what are ways of improving that situation?
Yeah. Migrants, so again, taking the US and India as my 2 points of reference, the southern border at this point is a highly digitally surveilled border. There are surveillance towers that are mobile, they can be moved from place to place, there are drones, and other borders in the world of refugees. Biometric identification is largely the way that refugees get access to certain goods. In India, there have been a series of acts under the term CAA, which requires people to prove their citizenship status within India. And they've been deployed very heavily in border regions, especially with Bangladesh. And so all of these have a digital component, a cyber component, in the sense that they are creating vast networks of digital information that's held by the state and can be used to enforce rights and obligations, the ability to cross borders. They can be used to, as I mentioned in the talk, and that report I put up, I think is very, very helpful there, to arrest journalists, people reporting in the area. All the data on your phone when you cross a border can be taken if they can access it. Some of these may be illegal, but they're still happening. In terms of remedies, I think the 4 points that I laid out about thinking about cybersecurity from the ground up, right? Different groups, for instance, journalists, need to practice cybersecurity that's aware of graduated risk profiles of people with whom they're speaking, especially if they are from these vulnerable communities. And so I think it's just a clear call to suggest that there are large groups of people, large numbers of people that fall out of state protection. And in fact, they're mostly on the receiving end of state surveillance, and the general way that cybersecurity is talked about doesn't address those populations in any way.
Thank you. I can't help but thinking, so it's kind of a humoristic association, but I have an issue with one of my credit cards right now that requires a security validation, and the only form of validation they're accepting is me actually paying, including a social security card, which I haven't owned in many years because they have a way of falling apart, and then you keep using your social security number anyway without having a card. So it seems like a peculiarly old-fashioned way for a company to approach a security matter with a customer in 2023. But in any event, thank you, Sarita. This has been a fascinating journey in how lots of groups are, easily stranded, as we are entrusting security matters to states and corporations. And it's also a fascinating historical reference to make there that we are still laboring really with a framework that is getting more and more ancient and does not actually do any just interconnected realities that we have been building in recent decades. And so thank you very much for this illuminating, wide-ranging talk. Thank you, Albert, for joining me in the moderation process, and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.